We stand at a critical point in history where democracy, when seen as a beacon of hope, is under threat with a modern form of political tyranny. 2 of framings. Number one, our burden is very simple. If I can contextualize to you correctly, the situation of the nation and how violent resistance is morally obliged and practically effective to tackle harm, we win this debate. And secondly, how will violent resistance looks like? I think this can looks like several targeted disruptions, acts such as sabotaging the government's buildings, communication lines, any infrastructures that is critical towards this authoritarian regime's operations because we aim to weaken their ability to govern effectively, or several types of armed uprisings like coordinated attacks by armed resistance groups against key regime supporters, including military units or security forces. Basically, to create instability internally and to reduce the regime's control over state apparatus and things alike. Note, it's not our main burden to explain the visibility for these resistance to exist, because it's a fiat, just the impact and why it's likely to succeed. To arguments, firstly, I'll talk about the moral obligation and why is this violent resistance justified. Three layers. First layer, then, people have the right because this democratic backsliding is a literal violation towards the communal social contract that has been like that and been so sacred since the country were even created because it is history based. When anti-democratic politicians win these elections, but they also aim to dismantle several democratic institutions, they violate this social contract, which then obligates the citizens to resist. Understand, the legitimacy of any government depends on maintaining democratic principles that has been like that for years, like check and balances, individual rights, um, political pluralism, and so on. These values are based on this democratic country's history and identity, and it is exactly what they need. It is exactly what is suitable towards the people. Democracy, it is not something that should be at stake. And if this is undermined, citizens have the moral duty to protect their freedoms, even if it means resorting to violence. Secondly, how's the long-term impact? We're trying to protect future generations. Look, when we allow anti-democratic politicians to solidify their power, most likely they're going to have a long-term consequences that trap future generations under this authoritarian rule. Violent resistance, we can prevent so much more oppressive regime in the future because we preserve these democratic freedoms for those who come after. Take a look at the French resistance during World War II, in which they're not only focusing on liberating France, but also to protect their future generations and free them from Nazi oppression, for example, because they realize that when the government becomes an instrument of oppression rather than protection, violent resistance becomes an act of self-defense against political tyranny that threatens and might have haunted the nation for decades after. This is aligned with the principle of defending one's fundamental right when peaceful options are exhausted and basically nonsense, leading then to the bigger question of why is peaceful options ineffective. Third layer then, peaceful resistance does not work in cases of democratic backsliding because authoritarian governments use their power to control institutions like military, police, and courts to stop nonviolent protests. They manipulate the media, they silence opposition, they use force to break a protest, for example, making it very, very hard for peaceful movements to eventually succeed. These leaders also have the advantage of several legal loopholes or basically rig their own elections, leaving peaceful political opposition with little to no impact because they're just basically a modern form of dictator the moment they're doing this. But then moving on to my second argument, talking about why violent resistance is exclusive and effective. Two layers. Firstly, violent resistance is the only way to stop the process of authoritarian consolidation, which will be impossible to reverse if we allow this backsliding to continue. Anti-democratic politicians use democratic elections to gain power, but once they're in office, they begin to tear down the entire democratic system that has been like that for years, like several independence courts, free media, fair elections. They completely tear down all of that simply because they want to keep themselves in control and in office for long. When we violently resist, we create an immediate and serious consequences for the regime because we cause internal chaos and instability inside of their office, which is great because then it is way harder for them to fully tighten their grip on their power. And this instability disrupts the entire regime's plans and weakens their ability to function smoothly. Furthermore, I think this type of violent resistance, we could break this regime's control over key state institutions like military, police, and even judicial courts, in which, like I've mentioned before, in authoritarian system, these institutions are usually corrupted and used to crush any type of oppositions that might come in their way that might try to take their power, like us civilians, for example, because they're helping the regime to stay in power. This is why this creates a more urgency to resist violently because we can crack these form within these institutions, leads to a lot of defections and weakening their own loyalty to the regime. Because to be fair, I feel like all of these like military, police, and force are actually into the people and they're actually working for us. And they might have actually have the same idea as us. They're just don't really have a choice because they need to follow whatever this regime is doing, right? Or the dictator, basically. When parts of this military or military or police starts to question their support for this authoritarian government, or even when they try to switch sides, the regime basically eventually loses its main tools for enforcing control. As a result, the regime becoming less stable and more vulnerable for them to collapse. This makes violent resistance an effective way not only to stop authoritarian consolidation, but also weaken the regime's overall power because we believe that all of this institution is actually on our side as the people. But then second layer, I think violent resistance has the power to draw significant international attention, which will increase the pressure on these authoritarian regimes, especially in today's very interconnected world. These type of acts of violence against oppressive regimes often make a lot of different global headlines everywhere, prompting these foreign governments, NGOs, human rights organizations to take notice and actually respond. This international focus leads to various forms of intervention, whether it is economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions like diplomatic isolation, or even military involvement by whether it is the UN, EU, and such of bodies and governments. All of which can then weaken the regime's hold on these power. In many cases, these type of external pressure is crucial for destabilizing this authoritarian government, as it basically limits their own resources and forces them to deal with this international scrutiny because they know that they cannot just stand there for so long when internally the people already attacks them and then internationally they have no countries that are supporting them. Basically, they have no power and they cannot really do their entire regime. Let's take a look at all of what's happening around us right now in social media, for example, and how vocal people are, especially in talking about world peace, where we would aggressively attack and boycott and advocate for a lot of vulnerable countries. Basically, these countries at the end of the day have no power anymore the moment international attention has been made, and that makes this violent resistance the only way and the only effective way to stop and tackle all the harm we fulfill all this burden. Very proud to propose. Cheers.